Now, psycholinguistics, an introduction. Psycholinguistics is that branch of linguistics which seeks to disclose the mental processes that are involved in the acquisition, production, and comprehension of language. It was during the late 1950s that the field of psycholinguistics began to proliferate, even though it had been in existence since the time of ancient Egyptians in 1700 BC. The period between 19th century lacked a group of people who are genuinely interested in the relation between language and mind, or language and brain, for that matter. Thus, there were only a couple of isolated studies, mostly rooted on philosophies. The onset of 19th century saw the people like Franz Gall, Jean Bouillard, Broca, and Wernicke who laid the formal foundation for the field. Though their work were more of neuroscience endeavor, Franz Joseph Gall, 1758 to 1828, proposed two ideas: phrenology and organology, that is faculty psychology. Phrenologists claim that a person's psychological attributes can be determined. The onset of 19th century saw the people like Franz Gall, Jean Bouillard, Broca, and Wernicke who laid the formal foundation for the field, though their work were more of neuroscience endeavor. Franz Gall, who lived from 1758 to 1828, proposed two ideas: phrenology and organology. Phrenologists claim that a person's psychological attributes can be determined by feeling his skull, the links between the bumps on the brain to the individual characteristics of a person. He proposed the concept of organology, the hypothesis that what we have in our brain is a bunch of faculties at a period when people considered every part of the brain as similar. His students, John Bouillard and Ernst Albertine, came forward with several examples in favor. Jean Bouillard and Ernst Albertine came forward with several examples in favor of Gall's proposal. This was immediately followed by the famous case of Phineas Gage in 1848. His particular localized brain injury in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex strengthened the proposed relationship between brain location and complicated functions. In 1861, Paul Broca came forward with the concept of Broca's area. He claimed Broca's area as the area of syntax, stressing the link between localization and function. He proposed two ideas: functional localization, that is the hypothesis that there is an area in the frontal lobe responsible for complex functions, and lateralization. Later, in 1874, Carl Wernicke found an area which he claimed as responsible for semantics and named it as Wernicke's area, with a model interlinking the three centers of the brain: the Wernicke's area, Broca's area, and the concept center. Ludwig Lichtenstein, who was Wernicke's student, he claimed that all types of aphasias could be explained as an aftermath of a lesion in any of these centers or any damage in the interlinking roots that they have. The development of the field of psycholinguistics is not independent of the shifts and upheavals in psychology. The end of 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century is a very crucial period in the history of psychology. Wilhelm Wundt, the author of Principles of Physiological Psychology in 1874, was an influential figure in psychology. He demonstrated that language could be explained on the basis of psychological principles. However, this proposal was assaulted by J.B. Watson, who established the psychological school of behaviorism. He claimed that psychology should be concerned with behavior and behavioral observation
rather than mind and consciousness. This set the environment for behavioral studies in psychology.
Early 19th century was a critical period in linguistics too, with tremendous changes underway. With his book Language in 1933, Leonard Bloomfield lined up linguistics with behaviorism. B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior in 1957 boosted the incorporation of behaviorist tradition in language studies. Soon, Skinner's argument on the behavioral basis of language was torn apart with Chomsky's review of Skinner's verbal behavior in 1959. He claimed that Skinner's stimuli-response theory cannot account for the productive and systematic human language. He redefined the field by reintroducing the link between mind and language. He made a distinction between competence and performance. His works are the grammar of competence, not performances.
Shortly after that, many experiments were conducted to explain the psychological reality of language. Chomsky's transformational grammar propelled many people to test this, and people like Miller in 1964 and Fodor in 1974 confirmed that the more transformations there are in a sentence, the more difficult it would be to be processed. This is known as the derivational theory of complexity. This theory states that the complexity of producing or comprehending a sentence should be related to the number of transformations that a sentence must undergo according to a given generative grammar. However, this theory has not held for long. Later on, the focus of psycholinguistic studies shifted to the examination of psychological, not linguistic mechanisms.
Now, talking about brain-language relationship and its models. So, human brain. Brain is the most important and complicated organ in the human body. In order to understand various concepts associated with the relation between brain and language, a basic understanding about the human brain is prerequisite. The following is a very brief description of the human brain from linguistic perspective. The outer layer of the brain is called the cortex or cerebrum. It is covered with thin layers of membranes called meninges. It is composed of three layers: dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. Cerebrospinal fluid passes through these layers. Cortex is paired into left and right hemisphere. These two hemispheres are connected by corpus callosum, anterior commissure, and posterior commissure and fornix.
The folds on the cortex are called gyri, the outer folds, and sulci, the gaps between gyri. Gyri divide the brain internally into four lobes: frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe. Frontal lobe bears the function of planning, programming, and the execution of programs and language production. On frontal lobe is located six important regions, namely Broca's area, which is located in the third frontal gyrus and regarded as responsible for vocalization and speech production, the primary motor area, supplementary motor area, premotor area, and the extrapyramidal area, and frontal eyelid. Temporal lobe is the seat of auditory perception, comprehension of spoken and written language. It includes Wernicke's area, primary auditory area, auditory association area, and primary olfactory area.
Wernicke's area is located in the posterior portion of auditory association area, and it functions as the memory store for auditory forms of words, and it is involved in the comprehension of spoken and written language. The third lobe, occipital lobe, is where the visual information is refined, assimilated, and analyzed. It consists of the primary visual area and the visual association area. Parietal lobe, the fourth lobe, is concerned with visual perception, general spatial orientation, arithmetical processing. The areas in the parietal lobe are primary somatosensory area, supramarginal gyrus, and angular gyrus, primary gustatory area, gnostic area.
angular gyrus is located at the junction of occipital, parietal, and temporal lobes. It has concept center which stores meanings of words besides reading center, naming center, and writing center. Insula and limbic lobe are the two areas identified as the subcortical regions. Insula seems to assist Broca's area and Wernicke's area in language production and perception. Limbic lobe, also called the small brain, plays a major role in controlling emotions, learning, memory, social behavior, etc. The major areas in the insula are cingulated gyrus, hippocampus, amygdala, and limbic association area. Other subcortical areas of the brain are diencephalon, which consists of hypothalamus and thalamus, basal ganglia, which consists of caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, and colostrum, and amygdaloid nucleus.
Brainstem, which consists of midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, and cerebellum, which is also called the little brain. Now, cerebral dominance and lateralization. Cerebral dominance refers to the phenomena of involuntary domination of brain functions by a region of the brain. It has been noticed that people with damage to the left hemisphere suffers from speech disorder in addition to the sensory motor control of the right side of the body. Thus, it was naturally concluded that all complex speech activities are performed by the left hemisphere. Hence, the name dominant hemisphere. The concept of cerebral dominance was first proposed by Mark Tax in the year 1936. He reported the involvement of left hemisphere in speech disorders caused by brain damage.
Later in 1860s, Paul Broca made key findings regarding the relationship between left hemisphere and aphasia. To say that language is lateralized means that language function is located in one of the two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. For the vast majority of people, language is lateralized in the left hemisphere. However, there are some people with language lateralized in the right hemisphere, and in a small percentage of people, language is not lateralized at all but seems to be represented in both hemispheres. Language lateralization and handedness are interconnected. Right-handed people, who are the majority, almost always have language lateralized in the left hemisphere, and left-handed people are likely to have language lateralization in the right hemisphere. Brain-body relation are of three types: contralateral, bilateral, and ipsilateral. Tell me about these terms.
So, contralateral, left hemisphere. In the contralateral, the left hemisphere controls the movements or registers sensations from the right side of the body and vice versa. Whereas in bilateral, left and right hemisphere jointly control the muscles on both sides of the body. In ipsilateral, in those connections where the same sides of the brain and body are involved. Human body is contralateral, hence the right-handed people seem to have a right dominant motor area. Contrarily, the left-handed people have right dominant motor area. There are many tests to detect language localization, including WADA test, brain mapping developed by Penfield and Roberts, PET scan, etc.
Language lateralization does not entail that left hemisphere is unimportant in speech processing. It is just the case that right hemisphere is more important for musicality, visuospatial abilities, imagination, direction. It operates in a more holistic way. Now, models of brain-language relationship. So, connectionist model. Carl Wernicke introduced an early neurological model of language following his seminal paper entitled The Symptom Complex of Aphasia: A Psychological Study on a Neurological Basis. This was later revised by Leishman in the year 1885. Geschwind supported the model with his neuroanatomical foundation in the year 1965 and hence came to be called Wernicke-Geschwind model. Leishman created the following diagram famously called the house model, explaining the relationship between different areas in the brain and types of aphasia.
So the model looks like It starts from the right side and goes upwards, and then there's a point of intersection where this point is named as A, and after A you have a triangle where you have the arrow moving towards the left to make up the tip of the triangle. So this tip is called B, and then it moves downwards and intersects the other side of the point of A, which is called M. And so M and A are then interconnected with the base of the triangle. So Broca's and Wernicke's area are represented as M and A.
Correct. Broca's and Wernicke's area are represented as M and A. Broca's area is believed to be involved in speech production, and Wernicke's area has a role of speech perception. The area labeled B in the diagram, which is the tip, is the concept arc, which he has introduced. Additionally, he claimed that all types of aphasias can be predicted with model depending on the place of interruption in the information flow. This has undergone several refinements in the following years. Now about hierarchical model. It was developed by John Hopkins Jackson. Brain and language are viewed in hierarchical terms here. The model treats behavior as the effect of the functioning of successive levels of the nervous system.
John Hopkins Jackson was one of the leading figures in the field of clinical neurology and was primarily interested in the analysis of language disorders and their anatomical basis. He classified neural activity and behavior into 3 levels of degree: basic functions, more complex function, and higher level functions. The functions, which are relatively automatic, involuntary, stimulus bound, are considered as basic functions in this model. He argues that these functions are undertaken by the lower levels of the nervous system, for example, sleep, respiration, etc. The functions such as response to powerful stimuli, rate of moving, etc. are claimed to be set about by intermediate levels of the nervous system.
So functions that are treated as higher level functions in the model include voluntary actions that are not bound to stimuli, and so on. These functions are assumed to be controlled by the most advanced areas of the brain. Language is viewed as an instance of higher level functions here. Now, talking about the microgenetic model. So James and Brown, who has formulated the microgenetic model, claims that language is a system consisting of number of levels of symbols, and speaking or comprehension involves realizing these levels in sequential order. Particular areas of brain like cortical and subcortical structures carry out the realization of these levels of language structure. His claim is similar to Jackson's in that, for him, the early stages of language production involves more primitive areas and later stages of language production.
So his claim is similar to Jackson's in that, for him, the early stages of language production involves more primitive areas and later stages of language production is undertaken by the more advanced cortical areas. His most significant claim is that this ontogenetically and phylogenetically determined sequence of neural activation occurs in micro-time, hence the name microgenetic model. Talking about the global model now. So the model of aphasia developed by Pierre-Marie in 1906 and Kurt Goldstein in 1948, which considers the disturbance of a single functional capacity as responsible for all types of aphasia, is widely known as global model. He refuted the classification of aphasia into different subtypes.
For him, there is only one true aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia. in which comprehension of language was disturbed as part of a deficit in the general intelligence occurred after a lesion in the posterior areas of the brain, particularly the temporal parietal junction of the left hemisphere. Summing up his major arguments, he put forward a slogan. The following is the slogan: there is only one aphasia. Broca's aphasia is Wernicke's aphasia plus anarthia. Now, talking about the process model. So, process model of the brain-language relationship proposed by A.R. Luria has close link with early connectionist model. The cardinal claim of the model was that the usual functions of language like speech, comprehension, reading, writing, etc. are processed, which can be further subdivided.
So they can be further subdivided into further constituent parts. The subcomponents of language functioning are involved in a variety of different tasks. Luria claimed that when language is impaired, it will usually impair a large number of functions. In his interactive model, he theorizes that the frontal lobes are essential for the creation of active intentions and forming plans in general, which is considered to be the first stage in speech production. Now, the critical period hypothesis. The critical period hypothesis, Eric Lenneberg, in his seminal book Biological Foundations of Language, which was published in the year 1967, hypothesized that human language is normally acquired within a critical period, which extends from approximately the age of 2 to the onset of puberty.
That is, between the ages of 2 to 13, in other words. He argued that after the critical period, language could only be acquired with difficulty. Any language learning process involved after the critical period will be qualitatively different from those that happen within the critical period. He links this with the brain lateralization. According to this hypothesis, the critical period for language acquisition ends with the establishment of cortical lateralization of functions. The critical period hypothesis was originally proposed by Penfield and Roberts in the year 1959 and was followed by Lenneberg's work. Recent studies in this area have shown that there is no evidence for a sudden onset or endpoint of the supposed critical period.
Since 1960s, critical period hypothesis remained as a hot topic in psycholinguistics researches. A vast number of evidences supporting the existence of a critical period for language acquisition were put forward, specifically those dealing with feral child isolated from the exposure to their first language until puberty. The most debated case is that of Jeannie. Jeannie was a girl who was isolated from social interaction until the age of 13. It has been noted that although Jeannie managed to learn English to an extent, her phonology was strange and has only very limited control over syntax and morphology. Susan Curtis, who studied Jeannie's progress in language acquisition, claimed that Jeannie was a right hemisphere thinker and she was found using right hemisphere for language too.
Now, Curtis viewed this as a direct result of the fact she could not acquire language during the critical period and hence the left hemisphere could no longer be able to function in language acquisition, leaving that function to the right hemisphere. Language and cognition, linguistic relativity. Linguistic relativity, or the Horphian hypothesis or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, lay down the relation between language and thought. It hypothesizes that the language we speak has an influence on our thought. This hypothesis was developed by anthropological linguists, that is, Edward Sapir in 1949 and Benjamin Lee Whorf in 1956. Linguistic relativity is not a hypothesis that was proposed on one fine day.
It was long being discussed even in the Romantic era. Humboldt is regarded as the first one to provide an extensive body of evidence regarding the principle of linguistic relativity by combining the insights from the then emerging field of comparative linguistics. This was followed by the works of Boas, Horff, and Sapir. The hypothesis consists of two parts, a weak and a strong version. The strong version suggests that the language determines thought, hence is known as linguistic determinism. This entails that speakers of different languages think differently. In this view, the role of language in shaping the thought is held so strong that it can even override the pre-existing perceptual and conceptual categories.
The weaker version claims that language has influence on thought. Now, basic color terms. Paul Kay and Brent Berlin and Paul Kay, with their work Basic Color Terms in the year 1969, attempt to test the principle of linguistic relativity. They studied 20 languages experimentally and made use of the literature on color terms semantics of 78 other languages. They proposed that though color naming varies across languages, the variation is indeed very restricted. Berlin and Kay presented evidence indicating that all languages share a universal system of basic color categorization. It was argued that there are universal basic color categories and that basic color term inventories of most languages expand.
Yes, it was argued that there are universal basic color categories and that the basic color term inventories of most languages expand through time by lexicalizing these categories in a highly constrained universal order. Refuting the linguistic relativity principle, they concluded that the language system does not affect the perceptual system. Instead, the perceptual system influences the language system. Now talking about developmental psycholinguistics. So the three periods in the history of child language studies. The three major periods in the history of child language studies are diary studies, large sample studies, and longitudinal and experimental studies. The first, diary studies. The developmental psycholinguistic studies marked from the period between 1876 to 1926 is labeled as diary studies.
From 1876 to 1926. The diary studies were always unsystematic and lacked any theoretical support. The parents took on the role of an observer. A merit of such studies was that they managed to get extensive data, though it was unsystematic. Some notable studies in this tradition are Taine, 1877, Stern and Stern, 1907, etc. Now, the large sample studies. Developmental psycholinguistic studies carried out from 1926 to 1957 is known under the large sample studies. It was mostly oriented on the theories of behaviorism.
Now, these studies demanded a large number of subjects and a small sample of data was collected from each subject. Some of the known studies in this tradition were done by Medora Smith, Dorothea McCarthy, Mildred Templin, and many others. The third study was the longitudinal and experimental study. Longitudinal and experimental studies represent those studies that are done and being done after 1957. The usual method involved in such studies is the collection of data from 3 children on regular longitudinal visits. The audio is recorded and transcribed. Roger Brown's study of the aspect of the speech of Adam, Sarah, and Eve is a good example of this type of studies.
Talking about Piaget's stages of cognitive development now. So Jean Piaget was a Swiss psychologist. Having observed the child language acquisition pattern in various children, proposed that child progress through 4 stages of cognitive development. He considers these stages as universal, that all children are found to exercise these 4 stages in the exact same order. The 4 stages of cognitive development in Piaget's theory are the following. The first is sensory motor stage. This stage begins after birth of the child and continues for 2 years. At this stage, the child's cognitive system is limited to motor reflexes.
The child's cognitive system here is limited to motor reflexes, which means that the language skills are basically feasible at this stage. The child seems to experiment what his mouth can do as he experiments with what his hands can do. In this process, she learns to imitate some of the sounds that she hears. So that's about the sensory motor. Next is the pre-operational stage. This stage continues from 2 to 6 years soon after the sensory motor stage. At this stage, the child appears to be very self-oriented. Piaget uses the term egocentric to denote this feature. The child begins to adapt representational skills and to understand spatial and numerical concepts.
These children use representational skills only to view world from their own perspective. Though they may face difficulty in dealing with abstract concepts, they are in a position to differentiate future from past. The next stage after the pre-operational stage, the third stage, is the concrete operational stage. So in the concrete operational stage, it begins around the age of 7 and extends till the age of 12. By the time the child reaches this stage, they could be able to take others' point of view. They begin to conceptualize and to create sequences of logical reasoning. The child uses language at this stage to refer to specific and concrete facts. Now the fourth stage, which is the formal operational stage. So tell me about that.
This stage, the formal operational stage, begins at the age of 12. Piaget considers this as the final stage of development. They could think logically and abstractly at this stage. A formal operational child is capable of using language to express and debate abstract theoretical concepts. Now, stages of language acquisition. Language acquisition occurs in following stages. The first is cooing. A child may start producing sounds that cannot be identified as any speech sound at this stage. Indeed, the child is experimenting with his mouth to see how to produce those sounds that he hears. First, 5 to 6 weeks from the birth of the baby is considered as the stage of cooing. Then comes babbling. Tell me about that.
So about babbling, the first 6 to 8 months is the typical age of babbling. This stage is characterized by the utterance of speech sounds that may not be seen in the language to which the child is exposed to. Most of the utterances are found to have repetitive CV pattern. Next up is the holophrastic stage. Holophrastic stage or one-word stage is marked by the utterance of simple open-class words or word stems. It starts almost from the 9th month and continues till the 18th month of the child's life. The two-word stage. The two-word stage starts at the age of 1.5 years, that is 18 months. The child may utter many sentences with words having simple semantic relations. They tend to use very few pronouns like me and you.
Next up is the telegraphic stage. Telegraphic stage or the early multi-word stage starts at the age of 2 years. The stage is called telegraphic as the utterances of the child at this stage resemble a telegram, which normally omits all the functional and grammatical words. The utterances usually take the SVO structure in the telegraphic stage, later multi-word stage now. After almost 2.5 years, that is 30 months, a child starts using grammatical or functional words. This stage is called the later multi-word stage. Now, motherese. Tell me about motherese or the child-directed speech.
So motherese or the child-directed speech. It is commonly employed by caregivers in talking to a child. It is observed that this speech register has exaggerated prosody and shorter utterance length when compared to normal speech or adult directed speech. Other features associated with motherese are the following: slower speech with longer pauses between utterances, restricted vocabulary, more references of here and now, more contextual support, less complex utterances, more imperatives and questions, and repeated utterances. The concept of motherese is accredited to Catherine Snow and Charles Ferguson.
Motherese is tuned up to the child's psycholinguistics capacity, and it was even argued that the special properties of motherese are necessary for language acquisition, as explained by Newport and Gleitman in 1984. However, it was soon pointed out that motherese is associated with certain class of people, and all children do not necessarily have to get exposure to this speech. Irrespective of this, all children acquire language at a certain age. Motherese was taken as a proposal against the nativist position, claiming that the input that a child gets is not degenerated one. However, the use of short, clear, high-pitched speech solves the issue either. Now tell me about language disorders.
So about the language disorders now. Language disorders are of two types: acquired and developmental. Language disorders which occur after the complete acquisition of first language is labeled as acquired language disorders. They are usually caused as a result of brain damage induced by illness, surgery, or accidents. Acquired language disorders are named with an initial A, as in aphasia, alexia, agraphia, etc. Contrarily, developmental language disorders manifest itself during the acquisition of the first language itself. These disorders are named with dys, as in dyslexia, dysgraphia, dysarthria, etc. Now, talking about aphasia and its classification. Aphasia is the cover term for the language deficits caused after brain damage or injury.
So, aphasia is the cover term for language deficits caused after brain damage or injury. It is classified broadly into numerous types. Following are the most commonly discussed types of aphasia. The first is global aphasia. Global aphasia is the most devastating kind of linguistic deficit in which the ability to communicate with language is wholly impaired. Mostly, this is resulted from the lesions in the left hemisphere of the brain. Now, Broca's aphasia or the non-fluent aphasia. The speech of non-fluent aphasic patients is slow, effortful, and deliberate. Their speech is characterized by agrammatism, telegraphic speech, and preservation. Broca's aphasic patients often omit the grammatical markers when they speak and speak like telegrams that carry only meaning words.
Yes, correct. Their speech resembles the style of telegrams that carry only the major meaning-carrying nouns and verbs of a sentence. Hence, their speech is called telegraphic speech. Preservation denotes the repeated use of words in speech. Though the syntax and articulation of speech is severely impaired in Broca's aphasic patients, their comprehension is spared. Naming is deficient in these people, which means that they may know the correct word, but they are unable to recall the word. Repetition seems to be impaired in this language impairment. It has variously been called expressive aphasia, agrammatic aphasia, motor aphasia, etc. Now tell me about Wernicke's aphasia or the fluent aphasia.
So, in Wernicke's aphasia, the pace and intonation of speech are spared. It is semantics that is affected severely in fluent aphasic patients. They frequently use elaborated descriptions instead of simple words. This characteristic is denoted by the term circumlocution. They may even create new words altogether while referring to something. The comprehension of speech in Wernicke's aphasic patient is severely impaired. Other names commonly used instead of Wernicke's aphasia are sensory aphasia, receptive aphasia, now conduction aphasia. So, the key symptom of conduction aphasia is the inability to repeat the spoken language. Tell me more about the conduction aphasia.
You're correct. The key symptom here is the inability to repeat the spoken language. Conduction aphasia is the resultant effect of any damage to the arcuate fasciculus. Arcuate fasciculus is the structure that connects the Wernicke's area and the Broca's area, and the ability to repeat the spoken language is contingent on the rapid communication between these two areas. The damage to the arcuate fasciculus will thus lead to the inability to conduct signals between the above specified areas, causing difficulty in repeating the spoken words. Speech production and comprehension is relatively spared in conduction aphasia. Anomic aphasia now. So anomic aphasia, those patients whose only language problem is anomia. Anomia refers to the inability in naming things. It is to be noted that aphasia of any type can induce anomia with other language disorders,
So it is to be noted that aphasia of any type can induce anomia with other language disorders, but in anomic aphasia, the only impairment is in naming. Now, jargon aphasia. Jargon aphasia is characterized by the large number of nonsense words in the patient's speech. That's jargon aphasia. Now, dysarthria. Dysarthria results from any disruption of the muscular control in speech production. It is conceived as a neuromotor disorder, as it is always a resultant of the interruption in the transmission of messages that control the motor activities from the nervous system to the muscles. So that's about dysarthria. It results from disruption of muscular control in speech production.
Apraxia now. So apraxia refers to the inability to generate the motor programs for speech production rather than the interruption in the transmission of messages controlling the muscular activities. It is a programming or planning disorder unlike dysarthria. Now, dyslexia, talking about dyslexia. Dyslexia is a learning disorder which usually affects the reading, writing, spelling, and the mathematical ability of the patient. As a general term, it denotes only the reading difficulty. Dyslexic patients can answer everything orally but goes wrong when asked to read or write something. It has been recently observed that there are a set of specific genes that are responsible for dyslexia. Dyslexia can be both an inherited and acquired disorder. Dyslexia is of the following types.
So the types of dyslexia. The first is auditory dyslexia. Auditory dyslexic people have problems in grapheme-phoneme correspondence, phonic analysis, that is combining sounds to make words, and phonic synthesis, that is analyzing words into separate sounds. Now, visual dyslexia. In visual dyslexia, the patients face problems in processing, recalling, and interpreting visual images. Now, the next up is mixed dyslexia. It refers to a combination of both visual and auditory dyslexia. The next is phonological dyslexia. It refers to the selective impairment in the ability to read pronunciable non-words. Next up is deep dyslexia. It refers to the inability to match the visual words to the words' meanings and is considered as a more severe form of phonological dyslexia.
Next up is peripheral dyslexia. It is the difficulty in matching the visual characteristics of letters to a stored memory of the prior encounters of that letter. Agnosia now. Agnosia is a condition characterized by the patient's inability to recognize signals that is being sent to the brain. Auditory agnosia refers to the disability in differentiating or recognizing sounds. Now, dysgraphia is a writing disorder in which the patient suffers from problems with handwriting, figure sequencing, orthography. Acquired dysgraphia is called agraphia. Now, echolalia. Echolalia is the automatic repetition of an utterance immediately after it has occurred.
Now, paraphasia. Paraphasia is a condition which is characterized by the substitution, transposition, or addition of a unit of language. Then, cluttering. Cluttering is a fluency disorder in which the patient attempts to speak too quickly, resulting in the omission and repetition of sounds, misarticulation, etc. Now, word salad or schizophasia. Word salad or schizophasia refers to the confused or unintelligible mixture of seemingly random words and phrases. Now, logorrhea. Logorrhea is a communication disorder resulting in incoherent talkativeness. So that's logorrhea. Next up is stuttering. Tell me about stuttering. What is it?
So, stuttering is a speech disorder in which the flow of speech is disrupted by involuntary pauses, repetition, and prolongation of sounds or syllables or words. It is both physical and emotional. The exact cause of this condition is unknown. Stuttering can be both developmental and acquired speech disorder. Now, language in autism. Autism is a complex neurodevelopmental disorder which impairs reciprocal social interaction, imagination, language, and communication. Autistic patients seem to be bound to their world or self and exhibit no desire to come out of their world, hence the name autism, meaning self. Autistic children encounter difficulty in initiating speech, responding when called by name, and make purposeless remarks.
So their speech is marked by repeated questioning, distorted pitch and rhythm, pronouns through pronoun reversal, echolalia, etc. Some autistic children are mute. They often fail in carrying out reciprocal communication. Now, language in schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a mental disorder that results in thought, language, and communication dysfunction. The patients often encounter problems in distinguishing between verbalized thought and external speech, and in expressing thought through language. Language impairment in schizophrenia resembles Wernicke's aphasia, as the speech uttered by the patients having both these diseases is syntactically well-formed but nonsensical. Now, tell me about language in dementia.
Dementia refers to the loss of intellectual abilities due to the deterioration of brain tissues. Dementia is commonly used as a cover term for many diseases with a similar effect. A distinction is made between cortical and subcortical dementias. In cortical dementia, the cellular changes associated with dementia happen primarily in cortical areas of brain whereas in latter the cells of the subcortical areas undergo changes. Alzheimer's disease is the most known cortical dementia. Alzheimer's patients exhibit language problems, personality changes, memory loss. Although the victims of this disease are mostly the people over 65 years of age, very early onset has also been reported.
Talking about Parkinson's disease now. So Parkinson's disease is the most common subcortical dementia. People with this disease show trouble in initiating speech, dysarthria, dysgraphia, etc. People being affected by dementia might find difficulty in getting the correct words, especially names of the people.